Sir, Worf spoke as he quieted a beep from his console. We are receiving communication from the Klingon cruiser u.s.s. It is heading to rendezvous with us and will be within transporter range in 15 minutes. Picard leaned forward slightly in the center seat. Excellent. Put the commander on. Worf nodded. A captain... He paused, then smiled slightly as Picard half turned to see what was keeping Worf. A Captain Katamok is coming on. Katamok? From the Tong? This is a surprise indeed. The view screen flickered from a distant Klingon cruiser to the face of the gruff Klingon. This is Katamok of the u.s.s. You are Captain Picard? Yes, Captain. I am sorry we did not meet the first time we encountered your ship. Katamok harumphed as though he would just as soon not be meeting now. Is Worf, son of Mulg, still among your crew? Picard half turned again as he answered, Yes. He stood up and motioned for Worf to come down to the lower deck. Katamok nodded in greeting as Worf stood before him. Worf, son of Mulg, you and I have a few things to discuss on a personal matter. However, before we do, I wish to pass my regret for the death of Kalar. From what I understand, she died a warrior's death from that Patak Duras, and you avenged her. Yes, Worf said simply. Good. Had you not done so, I would have. He then quickly turned back to Picard. Captain, my guest is anxious to meet you and your crew. Although I understand that he is not one for ceremony, but simply out of the honor for who he is among your people, you may wish to set a formal greeting for him when we transport over. Picard raised his eyebrows slightly in wonderment, so Katamok was not the only surprise. Very well. Say an hour? Katamok nodded. An hour. Well, Picard addressed the bridge. Seems like dress uniforms and a formal dinner are in quick order. Will, you see to that. Mr. Worf, a moment, please. Picard walked to the ready room with Worf in tow. Once the door closed, Picard turned to face Worf. Mr. Worf, Katamok seemed cordial enough with you. Do you believe there will be any problems? After all, you did trick him into surrendering his vessel. Worf thought a moment. I do not believe so. While I have not exactly been checking up on him, I have heard that he is trying to fit into the modern times, and having some trouble doing so. He is of the old ways, and still retains many of the attitudes predominant then. Were he to hold a grudge against me, he would not have said what he did. Still, I imagine that our private discussions may become a bit heated. Very well. Since Gowron sent him, I have no wish to be rude, but I also want to make sure that we maintain peace on this ship. Worf nodded. Yes, sir. Very well. Dismissed. Having absolutely no clue as to who they were about to meet, Picard gave Riker and Worf a quick look down as they awaited the transport signal. He knew how much these two, and himself, disliked their dress uniforms, and secretly wished some ill will on whomever had designed them. All was in order, as was the grand buffet set up in the conference room. In deference to Katamok, Worf had been asked to select a few of the choices available. Picard fully remembered the reaction of Kern, Worf's brother, to the human fare when he visited. Caviar smeared on roast turkey, indeed. Signal coming in, Captain, the technician called out. Ready to transport. Picard nodded. Transport. The energy shimmered in the silver collar, then solidified into a tall Klingon. Katamok looked about, but stayed on the transporter pad. Permission to board your ship. Picard nodded. Of course. Permission granted, and welcome, Captain Katamok. The Klingon stepped down to stand before Picard. My guest is waiting. Picard looked back at the tech, who nodded. Transport. Again, the shimmering energy formed a rough figure, which solidified into a man that Picard never expected to see, or ever meet in real life. He was dressed in an old Starfleet uniform. Its style was similar to the one he had worn as a young officer, but was decades older. His officers likewise stood agape as the human smiled warmly, curly brown hair tinged with gray, and hazel eyes that scanned each officer in turn before him. "Permission to come aboard?" he asked in a voice that carried gentle humor, yet carried a great authority. "Indeed, sir, and with great honor." Picard offered a hand. "Jean-Luc Picard." "James T. Kirk, sir," he said, taking the hand in a firm grip. "Please, call me Jim." Picard nodded and introduced his officers to both Kirk and Katamok. "We have a buffet set up in the observation lounge. It appears as though we will have a good deal to discuss." Kirk smiled and motioned for Picard to lead the way. The possible questions that could be asked of their human guest filled the minds of every officer gathered in the observation lounge. The officers had all met Montgomery Scott, Kirk's chief engineer, and Surak, Spock's father. Most had met Leonard McCoy when he toured the Enterprise D during the Farpoint mission. Picard and Data had met Spock on Romulus. None of that was as important as the moment. Captain James T. Kirk, alive and well after all these years of absence, was preparing to dine with them as though he had just stepped from a time rift himself. Kirk sat down with a plate load of food that contained not one of the Klingon offerings available. Katamok had been surprised at the Klingon choices, the best Klingon cuisine he had seen for some time. He sat at the rear of the conference table across from Worf, whom he eyed several times, as though anxious for this meal to be over so they could talk. "So, Captain," Kirk started after swallowing a bit of roast turkey, "I imagine you and your officers are wondering how I am still alive and here in your era." "Indeed," Picard replied, though there were so many other questions on his list. "Our historical records indicate that your ship, the Enterprise A, had been damaged during the battle at the Ganeth 4 incident and was in an out-of-control warp run. At the edge of sensor range there was an explosion, presumed to be your ship." "Yes, that is what I was told as well," Kirk answered with a brief glance at Katamok. "However, it was not the Enterprise that exploded. We were being closely pursued by Commander Kor's ship." Kirk paused. "Do you know who Kor was?" "He was in command of Klingon forces at Ganeth," Riker replied, "and also involved with the Organian peace treaty. From what I remember of the historical records, Kor was a fairly honorable man until Ganeth." There was a thud from the far end of the room as Katamok forcibly threw a piece of cragtail back on his plate. "Bah!" Everyone looked up to see Katamok barely concealing his rage. "You humans speak loudly of your heroes while barely noticing anyone else's." Picard held up an apologetic hand. "Please forgive us any insult, Katamok. None was intended. You must remember that for us, this is history, and the unfortunate truth about history, especially in dealing with other cultures, is that much is lost over time, or simply not known." "History is written by the conquerors, eh?" "No, not at all. But you must understand that until recently, we have had little access to your people's history. I am sure that there are, as you call them, heroes of the Federation that you have little or no knowledge of from your own time period." Katamok thought a moment at Picard's words, then settled down with a slight grunt. Kirk nodded to Katamok before speaking to the others. "You must understand, Captain Picard, to both Katamok and myself, Kor is a memory of only a few years old. Believe me, Kor was far more than I am sure your historical records show. I have seen some of the historical records on Kronos, and Kor has a legendary status as much, if not more, than mine with the Federation. While I never wanted to be thought of as a legend, among Klingons, such individuals are highly revered." "Understood," Picard responded in a solemn tone. Again, no insult intended. Katamok nodded, but was clearly not quite forgiving. "Continue your story, Kirk." Kirk nodded. "My ship was a runaway, with Kor's cruiser right behind us. The warp core was nearing breach when I jettisoned all the shuttlecraft and then the nacelles. All of them impacted with Kor's ship. As our sensors overloaded due to the proximity, I can only surmise that his ship was destroyed, and that is what the Ravager's sensors recorded. Without the warp engines, we dropped out of warp, but continued onward at near light speed. With little choice, I and the survivors used the experimental cryogenic tubes to survive. What happened to the rest of your crew then? Geordi asked. This is where Katemok comes in, Kirk replied with just a touch of anger in his voice. He had been sent to discover what happened to either Core or the Enterprise. He found us, but only had orders to bring me back. The Enterprise and its survivors are still out there, somewhere. Several eyes fell upon Katemok. I followed orders. Had I known of current events, things would have ended differently. That explains your mystery mission, Riker spoke up, but not why it has taken this long for Captain Kirk to be returned. Complicated internal politics, Katemok said simply. Kirk smiled and sipped his glass. A tale for later, Commander. The key is I am here now and willing to help with current events. Picard put up a cautionary hand, but Katemok spoke. I know you must keep your secrets, Picard. Gowron told me much about you and your crew. If you do not mind, I shall return to my ship until you have a mission planned. Of course, Commander, Picard said as he stood up. Mr. Wolf will escort you to the transporter room. I will contact you when we have something to go on. The gruff Klingon nodded, spun, and walked out, Worf behind him. Once the door slid shut, Kirk took a sip of his drink and turned to Picard. I don't think you made a very good impression on Katemok. Picard frowned. I certainly hope not. It was not my intention to do so. Kirk smiled. He'll get over it. Klingons tend to be like Tellarites. They like to put up a gruff face and argue a lot. As for me, I'm just glad for some clean air and decent food and drink. But I still don't understand why it took this long for you to be returned, or even for Starfleet to be alerted to your presence. Kirk turned to Crusher with a slight frown. It all had to do with Klingon honor. I don't fully understand it myself, even after all these years. Katemok is almost in the same situation. He isn't very welcome in the Empire either. He's part of the old times, and with bringing me here, somewhat set a whole awkward situation in action. Let's just say that he has a lot to prove to Gowron and the Council. Well, at least you're free now, Riker said, and very welcome. Kirk smiled and tilted his glass to Riker. Well, we'll see. Starfleet doesn't know I'm back, and I'm sure there's quite a bit of back pay that I'm owed. Picard started. Well, you might be disappointed on that. However, Starfleet should be told that you're back among the living, especially considering our current problem. And I'm sure you wouldn't mind some time to rest up on a ship with a bit more comfortable furnishings. Kirk laughed slightly. Well, I can't claim any mistreatment by the Klingons, but it will be nice to have something softer than a wooden board to sleep on, and an actual shower and supplies. Yes, I can imagine, Picard replied, having spent some time on a Klingon ship himself, and remembering how Captain Kavada enjoyed his attempts to make Data and himself as uncomfortable as possible. Then he thought of Spock and Sarek. Captain, he started, but Kirk held up a hand. Jim, he said with a smile, as another forkful of roast beef was downed. Jim, Picard smiled back. Have you had the chance to contact anyone at all? Kirk frowned slightly. Unfortunately, no. I've been able to update myself somewhat using the Klingon database, but I'm sure it is limited. I wasn't allowed to contact anyone, but I do have a few on my list. He quickly thought of one person especially, and could only imagine the earful he would get when he did. I will make sure that our computer and communications are fully at your disposal, although you might want to wait until I hear something from Starfleet. Picard smiled a little. I'm not sure how they will feel if you start letting the galaxy know you're around without telling them first. Starfleet can act like overprotective parents at times, can't they? Kirk nodded in understanding. Some things never change, but I do agree. It's best to catch up and rest up a little anyways. If what I think is behind your problems, there will be several opportunities to catch up with old friends. Speaking of which, Picard quickly asked, how much do the Klingons know? Nothing much. I only told them that I have some ideas. I wasn't sure if my generation's secret were still your generation's secrets. Excellent. We are working on the strictest need-to-knows. Even my bridge crew has been kept dark about most of this. The crew frowned at that reminder, but Kirk only smiled. Yes, I can imagine. His face went blank for a few moments as his thoughts wandered. What is it, Captain? Joy asked as she picked up on an odd emotion. Kirk frowned a little. This alliance that the Federation has with the Klingons. When did it happen? Picard raised his eyebrows at the change in topic. Well, the beginning started with your actions on Kittimer. I suppose things finally solidified about 20 years ago, when the Enterprise C came to the rescue of a Klingon outpost on Narenda 3. After that, things moved rather quickly. Why? Kirk shook his head slightly. Is the alliance fairly strong? It could be stronger, Picard admitted. There have been some internal conflicts within the Empire that threaten the peace that we have. And the Romulans are always trying to intervene, Riker added. The Romulans. I had wondered if they'd changed any since my time. Captain Savage said they would probably come to at least a peaceful coexistence with us. Then again, the Organians promised that the Federation and the Klingons would become fast friends in time. The Romulans became very reclusive for a long time, Beverly added, and have only more recently made their presence known. Captain, Joy spoke again, addressing Kirk. There's something about the alliance concerning you? Kirk shrugged a bit. The Klingon ambassador of my time once stated that there would be no peace between the Federation and the Empire for as long as I lived. I thought that perhaps bridges had been mended at Kittimer. And you wonder if your death at Ganeth actually made any difference in Klingon attitudes, Picard conjectured. Kirk nodded with a quiet yes. Your presumed death may have galvanized some, as Chancellor Azabor did attend and speak at your memorial, Data interjected. However, the factions that you engaged during the Ganeth incident were already considered outsiders by her new council. In retrospect, I would venture to say that your actions on Kittimer had made more of an impact with the Klingon Federation relations than your reported death. Kirk nodded at the reply, but remained silent. He finally put down his fork and drained his glass. If you don't mind, I think I'll take you up on your offer to rest up and catch up. Yes, of course. Commander Riker, if you will. Riker's eyes actually brightened. Yes, more than happy to escort you to your quarters, Captain Kirk. Kirk stood. Very well. Until later, gentlemen, ladies. Meanwhile, along the corridors of the Enterprise, two Klingons caused crew to stand off to the side for them to pass. Gaytamok had been fuming when he left the observation lounge, but had calmed down enough to talk. Tell me, Worf, are these humans as arrogant or simply ignorant? How do you mean? The way they spoke about Kor with no respect. Kirk understands somewhat, but these humans seem to laugh at our honor. You have lived with them. Tell me. Worf nodded with some understanding. Gaytamok was definitely not like many of the modern Klingons, and as such gained his respect, and a desire to know what things were like a generation ago. They are not dishonorable, Gaytamok, though I must admit that they have their own level of arrogance, but no more than we. I think Captain Picard said it best. This generation has its own concerns, and as a people, we have never been that forthcoming to aliens. Very well, son of Mulk. I will accept your word on their honor. Worf nodded. This cannot be easy for you, Gaytamok. I know how warriors of your times felt about the Federation. Much has changed. So I have seen, Gaytamok said with some disgust. He stopped and put a hand on Worf's chest. Worf, there have been times since our return that I have wished for death. Times when I think it would have been wiser to have challenged you upon our return and died in battle, not knowing these new times. The Klingon shook his head with a grimace. Answer this, Worf. Is there a place for me in your time? Is there still a need for someone with a warrior's heart and spirit? Yes, there is, Worf answered honestly. You have seen the Empire. There is a need for every true warrior, whether Gowron or the others think different. He placed a heavy hand on Katemok's shoulder and smiled. You will either find a place or make one. Commander Riker stepped aside as Kirk entered his assigned quarters. Kirk wandered in, amazed at the size. I thought this was a starship, Commander Riker, Kirk commented, not a starliner. Riker laughed a bit. I was told that Captain Scott made a similar comment when he came aboard. Believe it or not, but we do have larger quarters available. Kirk smiled at the mention of Scotty. I can only imagine Scotty's various comments about this ship. Hopefully I'll get the chance to catch up with him. I was glad to hear that he was still around, especially considering that he was so badly wounded the last I knew. Riker's smile faded. I imagine. It was certainly a surprise when we found him trapped in a transporter. Only Scotty would come up with an idea like that, Kirk said with a smile. I'm looking forward to seeing him again. Tracking him down may be a problem, sir. We loaned him a shuttle, and off he went into the stars. Kirk almost laughed. Knowing Scotty, I would start with Wrigley's Pleasure Planet or Argelius. Riker smiled broadly. Actually, the planet to go to these days is Risa. Risa, huh? I may have to look that up myself. Riker nodded. I'd be more than happy to give you some pointers if you do. I'll check up on you later. Should you need anything, just call me on the comm panel. I appreciate it, Commander, and give my thanks to your captain. Riker gave a short nod and left, leaving Kirk behind to contemplate the things to come. James T. Kirk? Alive? Gustav asked. Are you absolutely sure, Picard? Jean-Luc nodded with a slight smile. Oh, yes. After our meal, I even had Dr. Crusher run a scan on his DNA from the utensils he used. Everything matched up. From his utensils? Admiral Benson asked. Picard looked a bit sheepish. Seeing as who he is, I thought an unobtrusive identity scan would be best. Did he say anything about our situation? No, Picard replied, shaking his head. He thought that his ideas may still be a secret, so he said nothing, especially with Katemok present. Good, Gustav replied. We need to meet with him and talk. My reconnaissance ship should be reporting in about 6 hours. I would like for all of us to meet at that time. Both Benson and Picard nodded in agreement. If you wish to update Captain Kirk on events, Gustav added, feel free to do so. He was one of the original finders of the Guardian, and as such, I see very little need to keep him out of the loop. Agreed, Picard replied. I'll update him with what we know so far. Not that it is a great deal. We'll contact you in 6 hours. Jim Kirk found himself in Picard's ready room. He imagined that it would have been nice to have such an office on his own ship, but then again, it seemed that he never had the spare time needed to enjoy it. Other than Picard, Data was the only other individual in the room. Kirk continued to eye Data. He was amazed that an android would be allowed to join Starfleet, based on the times that he had encountered such individuals. Well, I guess he really did need to catch up on technology. Picard and Data had already told Kirk about what they currently knew about the time rifts, and the events that followed. Kirk had said very little during the briefing, but now all eyes were on him. First, I have to admit that my suspicions of the Guardian are the same as yours. However, my experience certainly does not include it being able to create rifts outside of itself, especially like the ones you mentioned. Kirk turned to Data. Since you have had free access to the records from temporal investigations, could there be the possibility of another Guardian somewhere or similar technology? Negative. Although we have encountered technology that provided a distant and immediate transport, Nothing suggests that such technology included temporal capabilities. Kirk thought. And apparently your archaeologists have learned little more from the Guardian than in my time. With the times that I have talked with the Guardian, it always seems somewhat disinterested in current events and only concerned with allowing travel to the past. That's one reason the Federation Council wanted security posted on the planet, since it seemed like the Guardian did not care who used it or what their intent was. However, Data added, since Federation interest in the Guardian has always been benign, we may not know if the Guardian has safeguards against misuse or not. Kirk nodded. You wouldn't know a house has an alarm unless you first try to break in. That may be true, Commander, Kirk added. But if this is the Guardian's work, any such safeguards have been overridden, if they existed to begin with. Causing the death of several people does seem to be the intent of whomever or whatever is behind this, Picard added. Using this time rift just seems so unnecessary. Could it be that someone has taken over the Guardian and learned how to use it to create these rifts? That is the possibility, Picard admitted. We should be hearing a report about the team who is stationed on Gateway. That could tell us a great deal. Still, if that theory is true, who would want to create such mindless destruction? None of the occurrences are in strategic locations. None are important to Federation as a whole. Even the reports from the Klingon Empire have no great importance to the Quadrant. There are no patterns to what has happened. There is one, Data said with a jerk of his head. The reports we have been at increasing distances from Gateway. As though something has been gaining power from each event, allowing it to affect space at greater distances, Kirk asked. Yes, but who or what would benefit from what just seems deaths of others? If one kills millions of living beings, there must be a reason why, some benefit to doing so. Kirk's face contorted as a sudden thought occurred to him. Oh no. Data, how far is Gateway from Argilius? Data cocked his head as he did the calculations. 552.65 light years. Kirk ran the calculations in his head. That would be about 70 years travel at warp 2. No, sir, Data corrected. 54.83. What? Kirk asked. I'm not Spock, but my calculations shouldn't be that far off. Warp drive computations have changed since your Enterprise, Picard added, once he realized why there was such a difference. Our warp drives operate more efficiently, and warp tables have been upgraded. Kirk merely shrugged his shoulders, of course. At any rate, tell me, has there been any reports of voices or laughter during these incidents? Not that we have been made aware of. Why? Just a thought, Kirk replied grimly. One that I hope is not possible. If so, there will be several more deaths coming. Billions, if not more. Picard sat up. Explain. What would this have to do with Argilius? It's a peaceful planet in the extreme. Kirk did not immediately reply, but Data spoke out after reviewing his memory. You are referring to the Enterprise visit, stardate 3614.9, when Chief Engineer Montgomery Scott was accused of murder, but further investigations revealed the cause of the murders was from an entity that called itself Red Jack, Kirk filled in. He looked at the puzzled Picard. Jack the Ripper.